everybody. Can you hear me in the back? Yes, good, excellent. Okay, so I'm William Rhys Dekle. I am happy to talk to you guys today. Thanks for turning up. I see a couple of people I know in the audience, so I will be sure to embarrass you. Today I will be talking about the cloud, but I won't be talking too much about streaming, which is what everybody talks about. So let's see. So first question, naturally, why the heck am I here? I'm here and I started to put together this talk because every time people talk about the cloud and gaming, they always talk about streaming. And I'm just tired of it always being about streaming because of the work that I do and the space that I inhabit. I see that there is a revolution going on related to the cloud and gaming, but it's not specifically about streaming. And I wanted to start talking about that, and I wanted to get a dialogue going. So I'm happy that you guys have turned up. Yeah, self-intros. Who the hell am I anyway? So I've been in the industry, the game industry, for 12 years, including on the retail side of the business as a director of merchandising for a video retailer in the United States called Hollywood, second to Blockbuster, out of business today, which says something about Rentail. But I used to run a purchasing org. I was one of the top 10 buyers of video games in the United States. That's $60 video games. And for the last 10 years, I've been working doing business development for Microsoft Studios. So what that means is that essentially my job is to know game developers and for them to know me. And we wine and dine and schmooze, and we meet at places like Game Connection all the time. And when they want to make a game, they pitch me the game. If it's something that is interesting for our portfolio as Microsoft, primarily on Xbox 360 or One, or for PC, sometimes for Windows Phone, then I will push for that title internally until I get a consensus that, yes, we want to do a deal with those developers for that title. Then I negotiate those deals, fund them, and make sure that I pass them over to production, and I wipe my hands of it, call it a win, and I go on to the next game. It's a great role, but it's a great position from which I can see a lot of developers, and I see a lot of pitches, and I see the evolution of the industry, and that's the position, that's the perspective from which I draw on this talk today. Other things that are kind of relevant as to why I'm doing this. I used to work for a consulting firm called McKinsey for quite a while. Worked at Goldman Sachs in investment banking. I've worked in lots of different industries. I've done the startup thing in Japan for 7 years. I have a perspective that is both at one time within the game industry and outside the game industry. And I think it's because I see the evolution of what's going on in the game industry from the perspective of other industries that I've been in. And that's also where this talk comes from. So with that, a little bit of a caveat. Who I'm not today. So I don't know if there's any member of the press here today, all my friends in the press, but I would ask you to recognize if you write about this, please do not say that I am here repping Microsoft in the cloud. I am not. I am a Microsoft employee, but I'm here as a concerned industry citizen. I have with a point of view that is not necessarily the point of view of Microsoft. The cloud is a very important thing for Microsoft in general, and there are a variety of perspectives, even internally, as to what the cloud should do, what our services should do, et cetera. So I'm not representing Azure. I'm not pimping Thunderhead. So I even mentioned a number of my competitors in this slide. So just please be cognizant of that. And just to know, in order to prepare for this talk today, I spent several months talking to people in the industry, not just inside Microsoft development teams and designers and so forth, but also people who are in middleware and tools, other designers externally, third-party designers. Really fascinating to sit down and talk to them about their ideas and the way that they're deploying the cloud. So that's really great. And I talked to a bunch of my competitors as well, and they were very generous with their time and their input. So it's all coming from that. It's not just coming from internal to Microsoft. So with that, I can launch into my tirade. So yes, streaming services exist. And when you say cloud gaming, they get the lion's share of the attention. There's no question of that. And yes, streaming services deliver their services today in a variety of levels for different kinds of games. And by and large, they work with the exception of certain types of games under certain parts of the world or in certain households where bandwidth is constrained and so forth. Will they get better? Moore's law dictates, and everything dictates that yes, over time they will get better and it'll be pervasive. I remember a time 10 years ago, I was interviewing for some global position, and I was on the top end of what was available for video conference solutions at the time, and the frame rates were atrocious. The other day, I was on Skype with my little girl here from Paris, and it was seamless, like she was right in the room, and that was a free service. So yes, streaming of games will become a reality. I have no doubt that that is the case. So let's move on and talk about the real thing. And my point is that the cloud is so much more than streaming. It's a disruptive technology for game development and for the design of games themselves. And it's already changing game development. It's a little bit early that nobody really talks about it, but even the companies which are being changed, some of them are unaware of the change, but we are right at the tip of the iceberg of a revolution, I think, in gaming, and we start to see here and there both mobile developers and console developers and PC developers and whatnot are utilizing all of these changes, and that will drive further change. By the way, so composition of the audience, how many of you are from middleware companies or other service providers in the game space? No one. Oh, one. And how many of you are from game developers? Yes. How many of you are designers? Oh, the designers skipped my talk. They will be sorry. But it's all right. You can bring them the news. And how many of you are from publishers? Yeah, all right, my friends. All right, so pithy little slide, basically talking about cloud computing as an innovation. Important thing to realize about disruptive technology is, it has to be a technology where at lower cost you can provide more power to the people who traditionally didn't have access to that technology, and that's what I believe the cloud represents. So let's talk quickly about some trends. The first part is a little bit of a history lesson, but it's not actually a history lesson because most of you probably lived through the last 10 years in the game industry. If so, you were on this journey with me, and so I'm just kind of reframing it. When I started in the game industry 10 years ago, a lot of these were like storm clouds in the distance, and then with every passing year, we started to hear more and more about them until they became the pervasive reality that we live with. So let's talk about the rise of tools and middleware. So 10 years ago, most people were not sold on anything other than their proprietary tech. And so there were still articles being written by developers saying that, if you really want a unique look and feel to your game, you can only do that with your proprietary technology. And that's why it's so important and so awesome. And whenever we saw game pitches, developers would be like, hey, we've got proprietary engine technology, which was code for it would be very expensive for us to support and difficult for us when we kill your game or try to move it to someone else. As maybe it should be. But for many reasons, tools and middleware have risen to preeminence in our industry. And if you look at almost any developer, they're using some off-the-shelf third-party tool and middleware solution in their game for great advantage. And the cycles that you used to spend building your engine and tools and whatnot that are proprietary are now spent customizing off-the-shelf solutions to make your game look and feel and play better. And this has been one of the factors that have kept the cost of development down and reduced the complexity. Because, for example, if you look at UE4, UE3, you look at Unity, these are engines that a lot of engineers understand. And if your game is built on Unity and you get into trouble or we need to augment it, we can jump in and help. Same with Unreal Engine, right? To some extent with CryEngine. Like if a developer gets into trouble and we need to augment somehow with engineers, our guys understand those engines and are ready to help instantly. It's not like a proprietary engine where it takes quite a bit of time. Or if you're trying to port and you want to send the code over to another dev to do the port, and they have to get into the proprietary tech, like that becomes a very expensive project as opposed to something that a third-party developer is going to understand, like UE4 or UE3. So we have that. Outsourcing is a similar story. Back in those days, most of the developers did their own art, and it was far too precious with it for it to be trusted in the hands of some unproven developer somewhere in a country they've never visited. But today, virtually everybody relies on outsourcing to some extent, and the strategic importance of the assets that have been sent over to countries where such outsourcers exist is numerous and incredibly strategically important. Back in those days, though, 10 years ago, we would have like the Forza team saying, we have some assets that need to be made that don't have to be made by us because it's expensive for us to make them. And we started looking for outsourcing solutions. And as we did that, we actually started to build up a capability and a stable of outsourcers that we trusted. And now, we as Microsoft, for example, and I'm sure all publishers are the same, we have these master agreements in place. We have proven outsourcing solutions. They're turnkey, and practically all of our internal studios and our third-party development deals use those outsourcers. So again, outsourcing lowers costs, right? And they provide muscles to scale up production while they minimize your risk. And these are all the ways in which, in the last generation, we've maintained the cost of console games so that they don't just balloon in budgets. They have grown, but we've managed costs through those things. Distributed development is on my list. So distributed development, I can't say the game, and it's not the one you think I'm talking about. But a couple of years ago, we were making a game, and I would say there were probably 12 entities, 12 different studios working on that game simultaneously from around the world, from countries from places as remote as, Wales and Scotland, to Austin, Texas, to LA, to Chicago, to China, and in parts of Europe. They were all working on this game. Some of them were doing modes of the game. Some of them were working on DLC. Some of them were doing cinematics. Yes, some of them were doing art outsourcing. And some of them were working on multiplayer. And others were porting the game on a different platform. So all told, probably about 400 different people from around the world working on the game at the same time. Enormous expense, but also enormously complex. And so distributed development requires a new set of muscles. When we finished that project, the executive producer said to me, I'm never going to do that again. And I told him, the simple reality is, you're going to do this from now on for every project we ever make. This is our reality. A 60-person studio just can't make a AAA console game anymore, and that's it. But this isn't where the trend stops. Distributed development, like I have a friend, a good friend of mine, David Edery. He runs a small developer called Spry Fox. They made a game called Triple Town, you guys may know. And Dave, has probably 5 to 10 people that work for him, and many of them work in different time zones. So there are lots of, I met one last night. He's been working for a year and a half with a developer in France, and this was the first time he's met him in person, right? So we have even small studios that partake in distributed development. And so that is a rising trend, and I think it's great because now we're not anymore as developers limited to whatever experience pool is in our small town, but we can draw on the relations and the expertise of people around the world to make our virtual studios. So that's another trend that has gained in prominence. The others are fairly self-evident. I think you'll all agree. The growth of digital distribution, web game portals, XBLA, Steam, mobile app stores starting in 2007, 2008. So now we just have a plethora of places to sell our games and for people to play our games. But this creates complexity because used to be you didn't have to think about where you're going to sell your game. Today, as game developers and as publishers, you have to think a lot about it. The fragmentation of game platforms, console, handheld, PC, mobile, yes, on and on. we're starting to see all of these choices emerge, and that lends complexity, but it also creates a need to rapidly be able to monetize, amortize your game across one platform to another platform and so on. So engines that facilitate that, like our friends at Unity, those things become very necessary and very popular. The migration of games as product to games as service. Anyone who's been in the technology industry or in actually several other industries that are not the game industry have already seen this trend. But essentially, games used to be box product. And even if they're distributed product, more and more games tend to be services. They're free to play, they're back-ended, they're MMOs. And this has been very useful and necessary for us as an industry. Certainly piracy has been one of those issues that has driven the evolution of service games, but it's also just the business model itself. There's always there's a slow race to the bottom in products, and so you have to make up for it with revenue and services, and that's just the nature of the beast. And then finally, the reincarnation of the small developer. This is personally the one that I really love the most. The idea that around 2007 to 2009, I think we all witnessed the demise of a lot of beloved console developers and the formation of a bunch of new small mobile studios as a result of that. And some of you might be in those or have personally taken that journey yourself. But it's an exciting time period simply because smaller developers are active and some of them can find a living. So what happens, when trends like those meet the cloud? Middleware products, they become services, and services become more powerful and more affordable to smaller players. So not just console devs, but mobile devs and small teams. Geographically dispersed developers demand, and they receive greater collaboration solutions. And we start to see that, and I'll have some explanations. Easy scalability becomes available to everyone. Games evolve from products to services. I'll talk about that. And demand for new specialized services create opportunity, and a bunch of you guys jump on that opportunity. So this is just, you don't have to read all that, so it's just for show. But game development's changing. Let's talk about geographic coordination. Geographic coordination has become much easier, and it's become necessary because of this whole distributed development trend that I'm talking about. And so both small and big devs, use things that help. Skype exists for that purpose. Microsoft is reinventing Visual Studios as an Azure-based service. We have, enormously helpful places like GitHub that is popular. Coordination, Handsoft, for example, is also moving to the cloud. And you have a bunch of services I've listed on there. Some of you may know, some of you may not know, but fulfill basically these kinds of needs. Communication, planning across distributed time or different time zones, as well as being able to check your code in from remote places and manage that as one solid thing. Like, there are just a host of these services that are evolving. The power and the speed of development increases as costs per developer go down. So this is, tools and middleware business models should be changing in the next 2 or 3 years. All right? Right now we see a dollar per seat model in the middleware space. But I predict that we will see more and more middleware and tool developers moving away from the productization and the charging per seat and drifting towards service. So the way that this works is, essentially, I've talked to a number of developers, some of them inside Microsoft, some of them outside Microsoft, and they're working with these tools. And what they're doing is they're translating them so that they actually work for massively parallel computing purposes, and they're using them in their games. The way that these contracts work, that code is all derivative code, and it belongs to the middleware company. And they're going to take this code, and they're going to say, oh, well, that's great. It's a nice application of our program. And then someone's going to say, hey, wait a second. It's not a program. It's actually a service. We could transform this into a service. Like, we could use Azure, we could use AWS, and we could actually charge people on a utility model. And that means that we could charge lower rates, and we could actually have mobile devs use it, and other smaller devs use it who could never afford it before. But that implies that we have to change the way that we go about charging people and getting money. We have to make it more free to play, as it were. And I think we'll start to see that. And we actually are already seeing that. But as the power of tools and middlewares change, and more heavy lifting gets done in the cloud faster, more and more developers are going to use these services in the cloud, right? And the scale benefits are going to continue to drive the cost down. So what happens when, animations are no longer done in your office with this incredibly expensive top-of-the-line machinery, but actually is done faster and cheaper through the cloud? You save, individual artists can save hours and hours of time, right? And given how much we collectively earn in this industry, how much we charge for our time, this is incredibly valuable in keeping our costs down. And that's just a singular example. So game development, in this multi-platform world and this distributed world, what happens when teams no longer have to rely on things like local builds, right? But they have those builds in the cloud and automated through services like Tsugi, which I think Unity bought earlier this year. I have a friend. We go to the same donut shop. His name is Ryan Payton. He runs an outfit called Camouflage. He actually used to be a lead designer for us in the Halo 343 studio. But he stated that his company, Republic, has gone from 2 or 3 builds a day to, since switching to Tsugi, they have 20 builds a day, right? And they have a global team, right? So it's a 10-fold increase, and it happened like that. What happens? Another problem that we have, for example, that can be solved with the cloud. We've always contended with this issue of trying to get our dev kits into China, and we need them because often we need hundreds and hundreds of dev kits for all the outsourcing jobs that we have, but we have a fixed budget in terms of how many we are allowed to bring into China. So that was a constraint that was imposed upon us. But what if those dev kits were actually virtualized, right? Well, then we wouldn't have that constraint anymore. So there are a lot of possibilities here. Okay, so, and we shouldn't forget rendering in the cloud. There's some really phenomenal stuff happening with rendering. And developers now have the ability to make high-definition, photorealistic images, previously incredibly slow and expensive to make. This isn't just game developers, it's Hollywood as well is taking advantage of it, probably more Hollywood than us right now. And they they allow for these images to be made in less time. So that's higher quality, less time, available for the cost of the computing time that you actually use. The practical benefits of cloud-based development technology go on. And there's not like a game development tool or engine out there that isn't in some way contemplating some sort of move to the cloud. For some middleware companies, they're doing it themselves. For others, their clients are doing it as part of their projects. So from anything from rendering, audio, AI, illumination, animation, collaboration, collision, we will start to see this migration. And not necessarily an obvious one, but one that's widely used. Because of the cloud, there's easy scalability, right? There are no more day one stockouts of video games, or there shouldn't be. If there are, pity on them. Without the cloud, developers used to have to make a best guess about demand on day one, and if they were wrong, if they underplanned it and they didn't have enough capacity, they would lose out on those potential sales. Hard to get those consumers back if you've turned them away. If they overplanned it, you were stuck with that hardware commitment for the next 4 to 6 months, and it would cost you an arm and a leg, and you would be screwed. But the cloud is great for developers of online games because it mitigates these risks very effectively. Developers are just getting away from a dedicated server model to the cloud model for the launch of the game. And then once they have predictability in their demand volume, they kind of switch back to the dedicated server model, right? Because it's more economically feasible for them. But over time, as we start to see the costs come down, I predict they will stop doing that. It's funny, I was talking to an internal team, the guys that make a game called Wordament, and it's it's a very simple but fun cloud-based Boggle with leaderboards. So check it out if you don't know it. But they say that every time they do a cost-based exercise to try to reduce the cost of operating Wordament, they'll take 2 or 3 months. Once they've finished, the cost of the cloud has come down so much that it obviates the need for the project in the first place, right? Which is kind of incredible. So back-end complexity. So as developers rush to embrace cloud-based development, there's a host of back-end services that become necessary, and a bunch of you guys have rushed in to try to fill that void. And so, you see everything from analytics to, finding users to advertising to monetization, everything that you could imagine. HelpShip, for example, is an interesting CRM, cloud-based CRM company. Specifically helps you manage your whales and monetize. Like, there's a ton of different services out there. But the most important thing to me is that all of this migration, this drift, this utilization of the cloud allows the game developer to focus on the differentiation of their game, right? And not on reinventing the wheel. So to me, nothing about cloud development suggests that the ratio of programmers to designers to producers is going to change. On the art side, there's tremendous efficiency to be gained, but really the big takeaway, the big challenge will be for the designers, the guys that are making games. Because what I would say is, the point's not really about taking the games that we know and making them operate through the cloud. That's the first step. The real challenge is to make games that are differentiated because they utilize the cloud, right? And we need to utilize what's special about the cloud. So what is it? Ubiquity, persistence, scalability, machine learning, high-performance computing tasks. So this is the point at which you will all realize that I'm not an engineer by trade, because I make it sound so simple. But I'm not I'm not saying that it's simple. It is. These are hard things that we need to work on, and I'm pointing them out because they're hard and because we've just begun. And I'm going to run through these real quick, and then we'll have some Q&A. Is that okay? All right. So these are, in talking to game developers, these are some of the areas of exploration that I see that we could be working on that most of us are not working on. And this is the challenge that we need to lay to our designers. So, for example, procedural, I'll talk about a few of them. Procedural audio. Audio guys have been talking about procedural audio forever, right? The problem is, with the limited capacity of client front-end boxes and consoles, it was rare that they ever got more than half a core to play with, so they never could do procedural audio. So they sampled everything. Our entire game-playing world is a facade, right? All the sound is sampled, all the, any basic wall that you hit is just a facade. It's just wallpaper. It's going to come back in 10 minutes. It's not real. But for audio, when I mean procedural audio, I mean actually making a virtual model of a physical engine. So, for example, take Forza. Forza does this to some extent. Instead of sampling audio, right, which is fake, what they do is you can actually create, if you're modeling a Lamborghini car, you create a Lamborghini engine. And you simulate the physics through that engine to actually generate the sound. So it's realistic sound. It's not sampled sound, right? And if you have a core or more at your disposal, which audio designers now do, they can do this. So if you're in a third-person shooter or first-person shooter, let's say you're playing an Oculus game in the future and you're on a console in the future, and it becomes important to know whether the sound is generated from a mile away, a half a mile away, to your left, to your right, whether if a bullet is being struck, is it striking wood? Is it striking metal, right? These kinds of differences actually start to impact your gameplay. Similar to that procedural content generation, we've all talked about it, incredibly hard, I know, but we have the computing power now to allow for this. Massive maps of not just procedurally generated content, but user-generated content that is persistent. So dynamic tutorials. Look, tutorials are, the old style tutorials, they should just go away. The fact of the matter is the game should be able to sense where I'm having trouble. The game should know that I've been away from the game and the control for 2 weeks and I've forgotten everything, right? And it senses dynamically by the way that I'm playing that I've forgotten certain things about the controls or the way the game works, and it cues me for those. And it should be dynamic and individual to every player. It shouldn't be this stock, boring, terrible experience that we have today. Intelligent NPC adjustment. So, Forza did a thing called Drivatars. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but it's a low-risk experiment in cloud computing and memory, machine learning, where basically the computer or the cloud learns how you drive as a player. It takes that learning and it creates a construct, a virtual construct of you that actually plays against your friends and other people that know you on Xbox Live. So even if I'm not playing Forza, there's some construct of me using my gamer tag that plays against my friends when they're playing Forza. And so they get to see the thrill of like beating me or me just beating them. But you can take this same basic concept to know the player and make game adjustments to improve that individual player's game experience, not just in racing games, but in all sorts of games. And then the persistence. Like today, like not to rag on World of Warcraft, because World of Warcraft's amazing, and my wife runs a 1,000-person guild on World of Warcraft, so I'm very in tune with that game. But it's the difference between World of Warcraft and EVE Online. EVE Online, talk about a long tutorial. That's like a day or two. But it's incredible because EVE Online creates one singular, persistent virtual world. And as a result, there's a real economy in that world, right? There's a real economy, and there's a sense of history. And what players do, they actually creates history. And so that's really important to the stickiness and to the user experience. If you think about World of Warcraft, the persistence of World of Warcraft exists entirely outside of the game realm, right? Because you kill a boss, the boss is back 10 minutes later. You're not impacting the world. And so the future, when you look at MMOs that are being built today, if you're not building a persistent world, I think you're really aiming at a past target. And here's another one, interesting, using the detritus of other players' previous games as fodder for another player's game. So in other words, what if I'm playing a game, I run my course with the game, and all the things I've done, the things I've made, the impact I've done, then applies to some new player's game down the line. I've actually met a couple of studios that are working with this concept. It's actually super cool. And then there's a hybrid model for those guys talking about streaming again we should consider. So, what my friends at Amazon Studios have done is they've created a pretty simple game. It's a catapult sort of shooter. It has hordes deep sort of masses in a tablet game, which is kind of inconceivable. But that's because the back end is all driven by AppStream. So it's streaming. And so that's all cloud rendered. And their behavior is quite intelligent because it's cloud rendered, but the front end is the local CPU of the tablet, and all they have to do is basically aim the catapult. So this kind of hybrid model for streaming is one of those things that should be considered. And I have a bunch of others we can run through later, but we can just take some questions. But I believe that all of these and more, many more, are places that we should be thinking about designing our games to be different and native to the cloud, and that will bring in a whole new wave of innovation into the game industry. And that's it.
Well, thank you so much. So we now have time for questions. You didn't talk about business models, and more or less you did, but how much did you think? So that's the
I just ran out of time, but I can talk about business models, but sure. No, look, I mean,
this is all scripted, by the way, so.
No. So look, I mean, that's in some sense the least interesting to me. Like first you change the game experience, then you start to think about business models. But I think the business model that's going to hurt the most is $60 retail over time, right? I think that will continue to exist for quite some time. But by and large, we're going to start to see the utility model take precedence. We're going to continue to see free-to-play as much as certain analysts on Wall Street and other people would like to see free-to-play go away. It's hard to get rid of the concept of free once it's in the wild. Advertising will continue. Subscription, I think, will continue, but I think we'll start to see more and more Netflix-type models for content. We'll see a lot of older content resurfacing as subscription services over time. I actually think if you look at something like Minecraft, I think there's a tremendous business to be had in server virtual, like having a rent-a-server. All the kids in my daughter's neighborhood, we play on one server, and the wealthiest kid on the street has a virtual server of Minecraft up and running. And and that's a great model. Parents want security. So this idea of gated neighborhoods of players is, I think, one that has some legs. And then, yes, revenue sharing from UGC and mods, definitely an upgrade to quality. So let's say that we play Call of Duty in the future, and you can have the 5-core or 10-core experience, but if you pay a little extra, you can have the 50-core experience. That upgrade is a potential business model. And then, yes, of course, download to own.
Even though I fully agree with you, I'm glad you also had this slide ready. Any questions from the audience? Any thoughts or further discussion?
Dissent.
Hi, thank you for your speech. Very
nice
insightful.
To see you.
I'm working at Orange, a telco in France. You know a little bit about Japan too, so you know that cloud distribution in streaming is especially well established in Japan and in France, the two major countries as for now, but it's still a very nascent way to distribute games. Do you think that in the future, the cloud platform for development of games, so I'm not talking of distribution in cloud, like Microsoft Azure or maybe like Amazon, will actually become the leading platform of cloud distributions? Or do you think that there will still be some kind of split between the platform for game developers to make the game and the other players, like maybe J-Cluster, who make the distribution in cloud?
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would say that, the evolution of any industry, first you're going to have the kind of radial evolution of services, and then you have a plethora of service companies, right, out there. And then what you start to see is a consolidation, right? And then you'll see a number of key players, right, titans in the industry, and then you'll see further consolidation. So I think right now we're still in this kind of radial evolution stage where there's just a large number of startups hitting different spaces, some established players, some guys with critical mass like Unity. And indeed, this year you're starting to see that consolidation as Unity buys up some of the space because they've pretty much soaked up a large percentage of the independent developers out there that are working on mobile platforms and some other platforms. And because they need to monetize that base of developers, they're starting to buy cloud services and integrating them and giving developers the choice to use those services, not necessarily to shut out other potential services that are third-party. So I think we will see that, but I don't think we'll see that for many years. I think we're just starting to see the very beginnings of some consolidation in certain areas of this industry. But by and large, what's going on here is off of the map. No one's really writing about it. No one sees it as a trend. So we're very early, I think. But yeah, years from now, I agree with you.
Thank you. Any other question? So I may have one for you.
Okay,
you
sure.
talk about usage, market, business models.
Yeah.
Any thoughts? Because, of course, you see how organizations have to evolve, and certainly the challenge of management as much as skills missing from a team. Any thoughts, recommendation you'd see from developers internally or externally at Microsoft to deal with these little changes, right?
Well, you know, I think that the first thing is that if I were a game developer today, we all know that let's say you're a mobile developer. We know that all of your markets are saturated with games. It's very difficult to figure out where to put your game next. And, and if I were a developer today, I would basically be looking at the cloud and saying, if I don't already have an identity as a developer, a niche, I would be looking for a niche. And the niche that I would hit upon is, what can I do with the cloud that's unique and different? How can I be the first ones there, right? And so if I were doing it, I would look at that and I would set my designers and my developers, my engineers, towards what can we do with this given game concept, but this time utilize the cloud in a native way, right? And I actually have advice from the pioneers. I'm not going to talk to it, but a bunch of people who are already working with the cloud saying, things they wish they had known, approaches they wish they had taken, advice that they would give to other developers for embracing the cloud.
I'm just reading them, but well, any comments, any questions on this list?
I'm glad I'm anticipating your questions, or at least trying, but
Oh, further thoughts?
Don't be shy. Jonas, you don't have a question for me, man?
Keep it for themselves.
Yep.
Okay. Well, guys,
Good.
thank you so much. Thank you so much for this very informative, very dense presentation. Lots of great ideas, thoughts, and thank you very much, William.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate you coming out.